So, hi everybody. My name is Maureen Folk, and I'm the Outreach and Program Coordinator at the Chapman Museum. I want to welcome you all to another talk in our series, Conversations with the Past. At this point, I am going to ask that everybody mutes. It looks like everyone has already done that, so thank you so much. That way we don't interrupt our speaker. So tonight we're lucky to be hearing from a friend of mine, Stanley Merritt. Stanley graduated in 2016 from SUNY Potsdam with a bachelor's in archaeological studies, and he went on to work for the National Park Service on a historic preservation crew in the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. He then bounced around working on archaeological projects in Arizona, Nevada, and California. He came back to the park ranger side of the Park Service in 2018 as a seasonal employee at Mesa Verde, where he worked until 2020. And in the spring of 2021, he began working at the National Mall as a park guide and primarily helps folks understand the Washington Monument. So please join me in welcoming Stanley Merritt for his talk, Legacy Builders, the First Activists of the Lincoln Memorial.
Hi, folks. Just give me 1 second here. I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can get a good look at the photo. There will be certain points where I also ask for y'all's input. Feel free to just type that in the chat. You won't need to call out. I'll be able to see that. So the Lincoln Memorial is a lot of different things to a lot of people. The number one being, a place to memorialize one of our greatest presidents and the great emancipator. But his memorial has kind of taken on a meaning of its own. And I'm curious for some of y'all what else you think of when you think of the Lincoln Memorial, besides just Lincoln himself. What other kind of events or meanings do you draw from it? If you want to throw that in chat, you're more than welcome to. I'll give everyone a second to do that. The Park Service has been pushing a type of interpretation with audience engagement, and so that's fun to do on Zoom, as you all can imagine. So reflecting pool, that's a pretty good one. Yeah, so we'll skip to the reflecting pool. This was built as a bridge to Washington and Lincoln to show that they are connected besides just being presidents. They have a lot more meaning to each other and to the country. For religious experience, it's definitely true. It is built in the style of a Greek and or Roman temple. So, and the feeling looking upon him with his hands outstretched, it's yeah, you definitely get that sense of awe, perspective, this, person with a higher goal. Civil War, also a very good one. This is, he has his Gettysburg Address carved into the wall, as well as his second inaugural address, which was given during the Civil War. Both of these kind of defining who he is as a president and how we remember him. Very important things. Marian Anderson, also a very good one, as well as with MLK speech, which really kind of, for some, defined the moment. But you mentioning Marian Anderson is also really important because she was there long before MLK in 1939. We'll touch on that soon. For those of you who don't know her, you will know her by the end of this. Another one people don't think of is actually another president's involvement there, and that is Richard Nixon. During some pretty heavy anti-war protests, he took a walk over to the Lincoln Memorial where they were protesting. And here he is with Bob Mastukis, one of the lead protesters. Yeah, his hands, which I unfortunately don't have a good picture of, are quite large. The statue is actually twice as large as they originally planned it to be. And that's so he wouldn't be, kind of smaller in comparison to his entire memorial. Some people like to say his hands are an ASL sign, but they're really more just kind of pointing towards you in a kind of like, I pass this on to you, I pass this mission on to you. The original designer did not have really any intent on that. But other people who were there had intent. People like Robert Moton, who you can see on the left. He was Dr. Robert Moton, I apologize. He was the keynote speaker for the dedication in 1922. He was also the second president of the Tuskegee Institute. In the middle is Marian Anderson, kind of the Beyoncés of the late 20s to early 40s, internationally known opera singer, broke a lot of different color barriers in the States. And then finally, Asa Philip Randolph, who was a large civil rights activist, union organizer, active starting in the 20s and going all the way until the 70s and 80s. So all three of these folks had incredibly large roles and really helped define the Lincoln Memorial. A little background on it first. Construction began in 1914 and slowly prodded on up until 1922 when it was finished. Obviously, during World War I, when the U.S. was active in it, construction slowed as most of your laborers and workers were also of fighting age and shape. So a lot of them did go over to that. And obviously, supply chains were slowed down as we shifted gears to focusing on a war effort than domestic products. But the work never stopped. And there's a lot of interesting history behind it. They used all different kinds of stone as a way of kind of showing off that, he was the great uniter. So we have stones like Massachusetts granite, Colorado marble, Tennessee pink marble, Indiana limestone for the interior, Abraham's home state, tiles made from Alabama marble, and then the actual statue was carved from Georgia marble. So every little bit of this memorial was meant to have meaning about who Lincoln was. And it's kind of great that, they actually had a very diverse staff working on it. Unfortunately, though, when they actually went about for the dedication, that seating was not as equal as the workforce was. Not only were not even the workers who had worked on the memorial were segregated. If they were Black, they weren't allowed to stay with the rest. So were any Union soldiers who were in attendance. This being, roughly 60 years after the Civil War, there were still plenty of veterans alive from that conflict. And if they were Black, they were not allowed to sit with the rest of the white Union soldiers. They were also segregated. And so with that in mind, we can take a look at that dedication speech. On the left is Dr. Robert Moton giving his keynote address, while on the other side, you will see a poet they asked to give a speech there. And you can even see just the inequality of their photographs. I've done a lot of searching and I have not found a better photo of Dr. Moton giving his keynote address, but as you can see, a much better shot of the poet. And even in Moton's address, he had to make changes. So a little background on him first. Dr. Robert Moton was the second president of the Tuskegee Institute. He did a lot of work beforehand and was really held in esteem by the first president, Dr. Booker T. Washington. The Tuskegee Institute is now the Tuskegee University, and it started out as a normal school, receiving funding during Reconstruction in the South. So they were tied to the state of Alabama. But quickly thereafter, they were able to kind of free themselves so they wouldn't be subjugated by Alabama laws, which, as most of you know, would be pretty severe for a Black institution quickly after Reconstruction. So under Dr. Robert Moton's leadership, though, they actually created the first VA that was completely staffed by Black individuals. It was land that was given to the VA by the college, so they were able to have a good share and control of it. So yeah. So for Moton's address, he was in close contact with actually President Taft, who he was a good close personal friend with. And so Taft asked to see his speech before he gave it, to just give it a good look over. Understandably, big deal and all that. So Taft asked him to make some changes because Moton was going to speak on some current topics and issues that Taft didn't quite agree with. One of the big changes was that Moton wanted to express this, begin quotations, but unless here at home we are willing to grant the least and humblest citizens the full enjoyment of every constitutional privilege, our boast is but a mockery and our professions as sounding brass and tinkling cymbal. before the nations of the earth. This is the only way to peace and security at home, to honor and respect abroad. So Moten was, putting some pretty challenging ideas, letting them know that things are not as equal as they'd like. Um, Instead, after Taft's suggestions, Taft's quoting, a quote here from Taft: "Our personal relations make me feel you will understand my motivations in the suggestion." So Taft felt like he was close enough with Moten that he could say, "You need to change this," but wasn't willing to go for bat to Moten so he could say this, so he could speak his truth. So instead, Moten chose to focus on the past and the troubles of slavery. Begin quote: "Freedom was the great compelling force that dominated all, and like a great and shining light, beckoned the oppressed of every land to the hospitality of these shores. But slavery, like a brittle thread, was woven year by year into the fabric of the nation." So, slavery being a big thing, especially obviously with Lincoln, um, he was able to still prove a point, talking about how the foundation of the country was built and how those brittle threads, while removed, are still having their impact. Here you can see how large the crowd was. And here's a more close up on the crowd right there. And you can see on the left-hand side of the picture, um, along there, there's all those folks. That is where a majority of the Black visitors were forced to sit. That's about a quarter of a mile from the memorial. So hopefully they had Moten mic'd up pretty well so that everyone could hear him. Um, but we don't know that for sure. Here's just another view of the crowd and how far back even those seated in front of the reflecting pool were, let alone the people on the side. But Moten was forced to revise his speech, but even that speech with the discussion of history and slavery was still powerful and was still broadcast across the nation. Obviously, everyone wanted to cover this. And that would kind of be the last major moment in the memorial until 1939, when a powerful and heavenly voice would bring the memorial and its owner to the world stage. So that singer would be Marian Anderson, originally from Philadelphia. Um, so she was an opera star, and by 1939, when she did perform at the Lincoln Memorial, she was actually already an international star. She had performed in Paris, Sweden, New York City, dozens of other venues. Even while performing in Sweden, the king was so much of a fan of her that he came down to greet her and shake her hand. So she was well known, she was well respected, she was a sought after guest in Europe. Back here, things were a bit different. In certain cases, like when she was trying to perform at Princeton University, she was denied lodging at the nearest hotel. And as this exchange was going on, there was a kind individual who said, "You can come stay with me." That individual was actually Albert Einstein. So this was a woman who had people who adored her, who were high up in society, not just royalty, but actual people who, through their gifts, like her, were high valued guests. Um, and obviously, this was more of a problem in the South than anywhere, Washington, D.C. being its own instance of this. Over the course of 2 years, she tried on 3 different occasions to perform at Constitution Hall, which at the time was the largest venue in DC. Constitution Hall was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Um, so it was after this third attempt that her fate would change. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And after hearing about Marion being denied once again due to the whites only policy, she resigned, and several hundred others followed her in that resignation. After that, Eleanor set up with FDR for her to perform a solo concert right at the top of the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. You can see her there with Lincoln behind her. Um, so yeah, a very important moment. So in attendance for 75,000 people, her actual production, as you can imagine, was broadcasted over the radio with all those different microphones. Before this, Marion hadn't been too involved in the civil rights fights that were going on at that time. She had kind of more focused on herself and what she could do. So that was a big moment for her, was stepping into that spotlight. So, and from there on out, she would perform numerous more times, eventually becoming the first Black singer on the stage in New York City, and a couple of other world famous stages. She remained a household name domestically and internationally, serving as a shining example against the racist rhetoric being put forth. She inspired millions of well. There was one member of the audience who would return to Lincoln with his own dream. Yes, a 10-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. was at attendance of this concert. Um, so Marion obviously inspired millions, and someone who would go on to inspire his own millions. Speaking of Dr. Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we know the impacts he had on DC and the United States. And we know that he has his own stone marked at the Lincoln Memorial where he stood. But this was also someone else's work that was being done alongside Dr. King. And that was one Asa Philip Randolph. Oh, there's Marion's audience. Sorry. So you can see well-packed, unsegregated. Yeah, so she knew how to fill out a crowd, and a lot of people wanted to hear her. And this is Asa Philip Randolph, someone else who a lot of people would end up wanting to hear. He originally wanted to be an actor, and growing up in the South, he knew he would not have the opportunities or the ability to be a full-time actor with all the Jim Crow laws. So he moved up north to Harlem. Quickly thereafter, though, he realized there was a lot more going on in Harlem than just opportunities for Black actors. So he got involved in the civil rights movement and labor reform specifically. One of his first things was a monthly paper called The Messenger, which advocated for fair wages and equal hiring practices, which was a big deal. So his first experience with the labor organization came in 1917 when he worked with a union of elevator operators. He became president in 1919 of the National Brotherhood of Workers of America. It helped to organize African American shipyard and dock workers in the Tidewater region of Virginia. Unfortunately, that union only lasted about 2 years until 1921, when they kind of dissolved under pressure of the American Federation of Labor. As you can imagine, the power struggles that were going on back then, like today, are largely class and socioeconomic based. So when somebody as big as the American Federation of Labor comes knocking, it's hard to survive. But he did not go unnoticed for his work there in the Tidewaters, because shortly thereafter, he was asked to assist in the organization of a union for sleeping car porters, specifically with the Pullman Company. Now, sleeping cars were kind of like first class today. They were the finest way to travel. They were commercialized. Everyone knew about it. It was kind of that thing where like that's how you knew you made it. Now, obviously, sleeper cars require, you know, all day maintenance, all day care, all day people working it. So they were steady jobs, and a lot of Black people predominantly worked the sleeping cars. After a particularly well-received piece of media where a sleeping car porter was called named George, all the Black individuals were called George from there on out. So there was a lot of issues going on there. In the image, you can see them in their uniform. Um, as you can imagine, though, in the early 1920s, trying to get people together was a struggle just from communication. And the Pullman Company was one of the largest companies at the time, serving the most powerful people with the most money. So they had a lot of sway. And also, these were good jobs in the sense that the hours were constant. You would always be working. And, it's just one of those jobs where you're going to have it. So there's also a lot of scads, people who are willing to cross union lines because these are the kind of jobs that you would want. And they continued the fight for a while until actually Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected. And one of the first things that he was able to do was pass the Railway Labor Act, which gave federal rights to labor on the railways, as you can imagine. And so even though that wasn't enough, once the law was in place, the union still had to fight. It wasn't until 1935 when the law was enacted It was then 2 years later in 1937 that they actually won their case against the Pullman Company. Employees across the company gained $2 million in pay increases, a shorter work week, and overtime pay because they were working 80 hours a week and not getting any additional pay. And so this is what kind of pushed Asa Philip Randolph into his, ascent into well-known civil rights. But it was in 41 that he was making his case known in Washington. Himself, Bayard Rustin, and A.J. Must, pictured there, one of the pictured there in the left, obviously that Martin Luther King Jr. as well, were planning a march on Washington to protest racial discrimination in war industries, to end segregation, and access to defense employment. One of the other big things was the proposal of the anti-lynching law and the desegregation of the armed forces. This was all back in 1941. A little fun fact for you that we're not aware, the United States Navy wasn't segregated until World War One. So from the American Revolution to World War One, the Navy was desegregated. For those of you that know Woodrow Wilson, it may not come as a surprise. But this was the fight to desegregate and make sure that Black people who were staying home rather than fighting abroad would have access to these jobs because, as you can imagine, they were not getting them, even if they were the most qualified. So they were planning this large-scale march. They had well over 20,000 people when Franklin Delano Roosevelt reached out to Asa Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and A.J. Must, and made them aware of his Presidential Order 8802, which was a fair employment order banning discrimination in military industries. So, they didn't get anything on the anti-lynching or the desegregation of the armed forces, but, a win's a win, especially back then with that kind of pressure and discrimination going on. So they would bring up the desegregation of the military again when Lyndon B. Johnson was president. And as we know, Lyndon B. Johnson did desegregate the military. So he knew what worked. And that's why he got along so well with Martin Luther King Jr. in their 1963 March for Jobs. So he was there right alongside of him with everything. So yeah, everything we've talked about, all these great movements, people, discussions, were all before the I Have a Dream speech, which is the most well known. That's kind of one of the crazy things and should be discussed more is not just these three individuals in particular, but all the different activists and work that was done to create the union that Abraham Lincoln fought for. But, since they don't have as big as names or they didn't have as large outcomes, or even because we just don't want to admit that the struggle has been going on since the Civil War, for these equal rights, these individuals are not as well discussed, or we don't want to admit that greatness can and still is obscured just on the basis of one's skin. So it's a real struggle, as we've seen. And Asa Philip Randolph didn't stop after the March for Jobs in 1963 or after MLK's assassination. He and Coretta Scott King, MLK's wife, actually continued working in DC right along the Lincoln Memorial in a place called Resurrection City. Here's him older, continuing to fight, continuing to work. And here is Resurrection City after it was shut down and cleared out. So Resurrection City was Martin Luther King Jr.'s next big plan and step that he was working on with Asa Philip Randolph. And it was for the fight against poverty. One of his King's big points was, you wage war against poverty, not against the poor. And this was to raise awareness of the rampant poverty across America. So they got around 5,000 people to set up a tent city right along the National Mall, along the reflecting pool. And they had gotten a 3-month permit from the Park Service. They had, gone through the right measures and they had set everything up, and they had about 10,000 people living there, far more than they expected. And as all good civil disobedience do, they overstayed the permit and continued living there for an additional 3 months. So a total of 6 months, there was a city of tents set up on the National Mall. The U.S. Army was eventually called in and cleared them out, and this is the after photos of them clearing it out. So the work never stopped, and these individuals and these moments, as we see at the Lincoln Memorial, have as much coverage as the people who built the Lincoln Memorial. Like the statue that everyone loves, that was actually built by a family of Italian immigrants, the Piccarelli brothers. There's all these important little things that we don't cover and we don't discuss. You know, and so we discuss all these things now because it's the time for it. You know, what Moten could not say, King could. On the very steps Martin Luther King Jr. saw Marion, he stirred others with his own voice. He brought about the vision Randolph had for a grand movement, one that could not be ignored and would be heard around the globe, like Marion had been. Fun fact, Marion Anderson actually attended the 1963 march and sang at it as well. So, you know, this is well after her time. She is quite older at this point, but she is still singing for millions. You know, she did not stop. She would actually be appointed to a committee by JFK for international relations. So these folks, you know, are incredibly important, and we still do not hear about them. We still focus on the one or two people and say that's enough, even though Dr. Robert Moten, Marion Anderson, Asa Philip Randolph all helped define and give the Lincoln Memorial the legacy that it has today, and in such a way that, you know, we would not expect or expect to even hear about, because we focus on one person for a month and consider that to be enough, when really there should be, you know, whole classroom, you know, years spent covering all these different topics, how long the fight's been going on, actually talking about people like Dr. Robert Moten, you know, who created a hospital staff by all Black people in 1923. Asa Philip Randolph, who was leading labor unions, which now are so important in protecting the workers, back in 1921. Marion Anderson, a Black international star, opera star at that too, um, who was treated with respect by royalty and was treated in the most disrespectful way back home. You know, these are all people that deserve to have their names well known and have their own monuments and memorials. Yeah, I want to thank you all. That's all I have prepared. I have no problem having back and forth through chat or discussing. Any questions you have, please let me hear them. Thank you.
Stanley, if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we'll just open it up for questions.
And they can be like just on the Lincoln Memorial in general as well.
Here we go. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, you stumped. Gloria, go ahead.
I'm curious as to the how did that relationship or friendship develop between Martin Luther King Jr. and Lyndon Johnson? Do you have any background of what was their connection?
I mean, to be clear honest, MLK was, you know, well known by everyone. And so if you were a president, the president's actually communicated with these people a lot more than any would suspect or know, or even covered, because, well, depending on who you're talking to, they didn't want people to know that, you know, how that political shell game works. Nobody would guess that FDR was reaching out to Asa Philip Randolph, you know, a Black labor organizer, or that Taft had a close personal relationship with the president of the Tuskegee Institute, you know, partly because we don't have the media we had today, where we see, you know, like the winner of the Super Bowl going to the White House, you know. So Lincoln famously had an open office hours, where just anybody could come in. They would have to stand in line and they could come and talk to the president, anyone off the street.
Wow.
Yeah, that was how, oh, I can't believe I'm blanking on their name. But yeah, that's how relationships used to develop, and presidents, I'm sure still today, if there's someone big enough, besides just whatever person's currently trending on the internet, that they reach out and talk to. So yeah.
I have a question if nobody else does right now. What kind of things does the Lincoln Memorial get used for now? So like you've been talking about activism. Does it still get used for activism? Is it kind of expanded?
So yeah, it's a bit more of both a formalized process where you do have to fill out some pretty heavy permits and paperwork, and you do have to put some money in there. But yeah, it's still honestly once a week there'll be a group, and there's also still spontaneous activism too. One point last summer when I was working, we had about 300, 400 Venezuelan protesters show up demanding, help for their country, justice for all the terrible things going on. And they just showed up and kind of took over the steps. And that's where anyone, even with a permit, you can't go above the marble steps. You can't go up to the terrace or into the chamber. So they respected that, but they still just kind of showed up and took over.
Into the chamber.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So, and we just let them hang out, let them do their thing. There was no point in trying to fight it when they had gone through, sure, the permit, but the permits actually do cost a fair amount of money. So, but yeah.
Interesting.
I think it's interesting that Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's only adult son that lived to adulthood, was president at one time of the Pullman Company, and also became board chair, all at the time that the African-American staff was really put out because they couldn't really get some decent working conditions. And also the last time in public that Robert Todd Lincoln appeared was actually at the dedication of his father's Lincoln Memorial.
Yeah, I didn't put it, but there is once again a great photo of him at the dedication ceremony.
Oh, okay.
I mean, not surprising, but yeah.
Sure.
He has a home in Manchester, Vermont, which I've been to, and
Right.
there's a Pullman car on the property. It's
Yeah.
wonderful, and of course his home is just lovely. And I didn't realize that he lived in Manchester, Vermont. I mean, I guess I just figured, Illinois was Illinois, for the Lincoln family.
Mhm.
But yeah, no, I
There's
read
a-
his book too.
Yeah. Oh, the biography
Mhm.
of Lincoln. Yeah, of Robert Todd Lincoln. A lot of the research was done at his Hildene, Manchester home.
Right.
So it's quite well done.
Yeah. Family relations, you kind of forget, how long people live for and how
Mhm.
active people are. It always makes for interesting, retrospectives looking back and wondering like, oh, how interconnected, especially back then, things are.
Yeah.
Robert Todd Lincoln was actually at involved in two other presidential assassinations as well. So he just
Yes.
has a really tragic, long history.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Were there any other questions? Sure.
I'm just curious, do they ever do any kind of special program like around either Lincoln's birthday or the time of his assassination? I mean, did they do anything to honor Lincoln himself? Or because it seems to me now that the monument has really taken on its own identity, that it's grander than Lincoln. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's one of the main things I wanted to try and highlight is how this memorial really has taken on its own life. Sure, you can go there and celebrate and honor Lincoln, but it has become so much more, as any good memorial really should. It can stand for one thing, but to really
Right.
honor and remember someone's memory, you want to continue the fight that they fought, as long as it was a fight worth fighting, of course. But yeah, so we do have the Ford's Theater, which is the theater he was assassinated in,
Right.
shot in. So that's a great site to check out, and they definitely do a lot there. For the memorial himself, we do try and have like some programming, usually a wreath laying or like rangers giving talks there. Obviously not so much in the past 2 years, but yeah,
Right.
they normally do some good stuff. We did have a month-long celebration of the dedication of the memorial this past May. So I developed this program for talking about the memorial. And some people did focus on Lincoln himself as well, as one should. It is his memorial after all. But yeah, something like this does take on its own life, you know. Same thing with the Washington Monument. It's hilarious how many people ask, what was this built for, you know? They just see it as one of the nation's monuments that everyone knows, but they don't actually know the reasoning behind it. But the Lincoln Memorial, people know that for so many different reasons. You don't get asked why was this built there, because well, people know it was for Lincoln, and now it's this whole other meaning behind it, place to be heard and to be seen.
Yeah, I do remember, I haven't been there in a while, but I remember the last time I went, it was probably, will probably be like maybe 2006, 7. But I do remember seeing so many foreign tourists there, from all over the world. And I felt good. I felt good. They were very impressed with all our monuments there. It's kind of a nice area because you've got Lincoln, you've got Washington, and you've got Jefferson over there. But I was impressed to see all the foreign visitors, and they were reading the walls of Lincoln's address, and made me feel good. That it really did.
Yeah, it's definitely.
You got to be hopeful, I guess, right? You have to stay hopeful.
It's a very good place for people to come together and just talk. And some of the conversations, especially at the Lincoln Memorial in particular, like during a big rainstorm or when it was really hot, you would just see strangers having, was always really cool.
Nice.
Yeah.
So have we progressed?
That's a loaded question.
It got quiet. It got very quiet, didn't it?
It is.
All right. Next.
I mean, in many ways, yes, of course, progression is something that will happen. But as everyone knows, 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah.
When you go to a place like the Lincoln Memorial, like the Washington Monument, and you know the history, you know what people have fought for there. It's hard to be a cynic about it. It's hard to be jaded when you see everything that's happening there. But at the same time, you go 2 blocks up out of it and you could see where that cynicism could come into play.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, looking back, I think a lot of people would be impressed, by steps being made and how things are going. But I don't know. You would have, not to sound mean, but you would have to be foolish to think that there isn't always more work to be done.
Oh my. Yeah.
And that's why I think these memorials really do a good way of showing. Speaking of Dr. Martin Luther King so much, like if any of you have been to his memorial, he's a relief where his torso, his face, his arms, all that is incredibly well detailed, carved out, but his legs remain unfinished. And it's both a way of showing that, his life was cut short. He did die much younger than he could have lived to be, but also his work still needs to be done. Still more work needs to be done there. But yeah, there's messages of hopes there too. There's all his different speeches. And it's a really well done because it starts on the left-hand side with the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And then it's like a concave wall as it goes and goes to the other side. And the final quote is one of his about justice. So, it's showing that, yes, we've had come far, but there is still much more work to be done.
I'm just thinking, how did the architect, why did he make that shape? Do you know why he built it that way?
For the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial?
No, I'm sorry. I'm still thinking about Lincoln.
Oh, so, I mean, Greek and Roman architecture was all the rage back in the day then. So, and also when you think about, these monolithic, these giant figures and what they represent, they do, as much as the United States isn't a theocracy or a, monarchy, like these are still the people we think to. These are still who they quote, you know. People
Oh
talk
my.
about presidents all the time, talk about I look back at what Lincoln has said and what he thought. And so in some way they do kind of become deified in a sense, you know. But at the same time, you know, we see their faces, we see everything about them, we know their history, so they lose that kind of mystique. But you still want to hold them in that regard.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And plus, it just looks really cool, to be frank.
Makes for a great photo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
like that one.
Yeah,
Other
fun fact, the
questions? Oh, sorry, Stanley, go ahead.
I was going to say the Washington Monument was originally supposed to have a temple or colonnade around the base of it as well in the original design. So,
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, but money.
money. Oh, wow.
Are there other questions? Great. Well, then I think we're all set to wrap up here. Stanley, I just want to give you a round
Thank
of
you.
applause, a
It was
virtual round
excellent.
of applause. Thank you so, so much.
Very informative. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I want to thank everybody for joining us, and feel free to look ahead to September's conversation with the past. I will actually be giving a talk on the logging industry here in Glens Falls. That'll be in person the second Wednesday in September. So look ahead on your calendars for that. Great, and everybody have a nice night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, everybody
you.
enjoy.
Thanks,
Stay
Stanley.
cool. Stay cool.
No problem. Thanks, y'all, for coming.